going to talk about risk assessment. By the end of this section, you'll be able to identify the purpose of a risk assessment and state when a risk assessment should be carried out. Identify various hazards from pictures, and that will be in a task that you do after the PowerPoint, and consider and list some ways to minimise the risks from these hazards using the hierarchy of controls, which we'll talk about later. Well, risk assessments. One of the main points of the Health and Safety at Works Act that you would have seen in the last video is to provide a safe working environment, and key to being able to do that is a risk assessment. Risk assessments allow the employer to look for ways where the employees might be harmed and plan how to reduce these risks. There's lots and lots of different ways of doing risk assessments, but they all have some key similarities, and that's what we're going to look at in this session. Essentially, the employer needs to identify the risk, assess the risk, put in control measures if appropriate, and then review that periodically. Risk assessments should be carried out before any work starts. The purpose of the risk assessment is to think about the things that could cause people harm, and these are called the hazard in the risk assessment terminology. You also need to think about who might be harmed by the hazard and how likely the person is to be harmed by the hazard. And all of these things come together to create something called the risk factor, which we're going to look at a bit later on. And they all come together to contribute to how much time and effort you need to spend looking at the control measures. If there is something that's likely to cause people harm, the employer must put in place measures to prevent that. And as we said in the last slide, risk assessment should be reviewed regularly, possibly yearly, or after an accident, which might make people think, do we need to change things? Okay, identifying hazards. So as we've said, a hazard is anything that could potentially cause harm. So chemicals potentially could be a hazard, electricity is a hazard, working at height is a hazard. Slips and trips and falls, and the hazards would be ranked based on the severity of the outcome. Essentially, if there's a risk of death, for example, from working at height, actually one of the biggest causes of death in the construction industry, you would take more precautions than if, for example, there was a risk of a slip or a trip. But in all cases, you would need to take precautions, but the amount of precautions you'd take would depend on the severity of the potential outcome. And again, worth noting, okay, we have a responsibility as employees to report any hazards if we see them, and that's actually laid out in the Health and Safety at Works Act, like we mentioned in one of the earlier videos. Alrighty, we need to assess, think about who might be harmed and how. So for each hazard, think about who might be harmed by it, and then that'll help you consider the control measures. You know, if it's only going to be people who are in after hours that are going to be at risk, then you can focus your thought process, your control measures on controlling the risk, the hazard to those people. Whereas obviously if people were in during the day were at risk, then you'd sort of focus your attentions there. Okay, yep, so young workers, migrant workers, expectant mothers are all potentially people who might be at greater risk. Younger people obviously are inexperienced, you know, they don't have the same life experience as people who have been on the planet for longer, you know, and as such they don't always necessarily identify hazards. So we need to pay particular attention to people, mainly under the age of 18 really, but certainly sort of young people need particular attention with regards to risk assessments. Migrant workers as well, because obviously if you have English as a second language, maybe it can be a little bit more difficult to sort of understand things and get to grips with them initially, you know, because of the language difference, you know. But so it's another place where you need to pay particular attention in a risk assessment. As well as assessing the who might be harmed, you need to think about the likelihood of the person being harmed. You know, if you've put in a lot of control measures already, and there's a very, very small chance that someone might be harmed, well, depending on the severity, you might not actually need to make put any more precautions in place, because you can't completely remove risk on a building site. You know, it's always going to be there, but the employer has to reduce it to as much as reasonably practicable, essentially. So reduce it to a level where people are unlikely to be harmed unless they make a mistake, essentially. Alrighty, so the term used in risk assessments for assessing the likelihood is risk, and the risk is the chance, high or low, that someone could be harmed by a hazard. The more likely it is someone's going to be harmed, the more consideration you need to make with regard to your control measures. Okay, risk rating, some people call it risk ratio, or hazard ranking. All of these things are tell us essentially how much consideration we should take to that risk, essentially. So if you've got a situation where the hazard might cause minor injuries, but no medical treatment would be required, if it's actually considered as a low kind of risk rating, up to may happen at some time, you know. Only actually sort of moves up towards medium, where you have to probably think a little bit more and put some more control measures in place when it gets to expected to occur, you know. But obviously, sort of with fatality, which is right at the end of the consequence scale. So if the likelihood of injury from a hazard would be a fatality, then sort of we need to take it very, very seriously, for obvious reasons. So where the level of consequence and the level of likelihood both come together to sort of inform the risk rating or hazard ranking, whatever you want to call it. And the higher the likelihood, the higher the consequence, the greater the risk rating, and as such, the bigger the amount of effort to be put towards the control measures, which we're going to talk about now. Control measures. Okay. Essentially, control measures are what we do to reduce or remove either a hazard or the risk of somebody being harmed by a hazard. And obviously the amount of time and effort spent with regards to the control measures would be directly impacted by the risk rating. So, and there's a hierarchy of controls for control measures, starting with elimination. Okay, if you can completely remove the hazard, that is the ideal thing to do. That's perfect. If you can't do that, and it's not always possible, sort of substitution, so replacing the hazardous thing with something else. For example, if you were working with an oil, for example, that might have been carcinogenic, you could replace, but you have to use the oil. The oil is an essential part of the process of what you're doing, maintaining tools, whatever. Then in that case you would substitute the oil for one that's less hazardous. Engineering controls, the prime example of this really would be on a building site where the roads, when I first started, the roads for the building site were these sort of mud tracks, and sort of there'd be people walking up and down it with the forklifts sort of shooting up and down the road sort of at a similar sort of time. But in most big sites these days you have a separate walkway for people with a barrier between the road, and that would be an example of an engineering control, something to isolate people from the hazards, because obviously the forklift's going to be a hazard. Administrative controls, this is essentially talking about training. The employer has a responsibility to train people to make sure they know how to carry out the job safely. And administrative controls is another way of saying training. Essentially, give people, change the way people work through training. And finally, the least effective, but it's probably the most visible in a lot of ways, is PPE, personal protective equipment. The employer has to provide personal protective equipment if required, but it's actually the least effective of all the control measures. What they should try and do is work through elimination, substitution, engineering controls, isolating people from the hazard, training, and then as a very last resort, personal protective equipment. So once the risk assessment has been carried out, if the company employs 5 or more people, they have to record that outcome. They need to write it down okay. So and they should be made available to staff as well, if and when they would need to see them. Okay, and these are one of the things that an HSE inspector would ask to see if there's been an accident or incident on site. And as we've said, at the end of the process and at the end of every year, these risk assessments should be reviewed. They should be looked at, thought about, seen if there's any way that they could be improved. A good way to do this is actually talking to the workers. You know, your employer hopefully should speak to possibly a representative, a union representative, health and safety representative, and sort of speak to them. Is there anything we need to change with regards to our risk assessments and we need to improve? Excuse me. As well as considering any accidents that might have happened over the year, any near misses that might have happened. A near miss is when an accident's nearly happened, but luckily it's not actually happened, and these should be reported just the same as if an accident had happened, you know, because obviously you can prevent potentially an accident happening in the future. Quick example of sort of knocked together a few things that I'd thought about with regards to sort of actually carrying out a risk assessment. I thought, well, one of the big hazards that we see on a building site are industrial vehicles like forklifts and stuff. And what is it that should be done, that quite often is done these days, most often is done these days, to keep people safe? And the risk from industrial vehicles is potentially a fatality. If someone gets hit by a forklift, they're going to be in trouble, you know. And on a building site, a busy building site, there's a reasonable to high chance that somebody will get hit at some point if we don't put appropriate control measures in place. So if we say may occur at some time, which is our number 3 on our likelihood scale along to fatality, we can see that the risk factor is very, very high. So we need to seriously consider control measures for this. Using the hierarchy controls, these are some of the things you might consider doing a risk assessment for industrial vehicles on a building site. Possibly you might consider only having one industrial vehicle on site at a time, which obviously eliminates the possibility of having more than one, several vehicles running around, because obviously the more vehicles on the site, the higher the likelihood of somebody being injured. You may well sort of plan and well signpost the route that the forklifts can travel on, possibly stick with one-way systems. A barriered walkway, which would be an example of engineering controls. You're physically removing sort of people from the hazard. Things like a speed limit, 5 miles an hour speed limit, makes people so much more safe. It's going to cause a lot less damage being hit at 5 miles an hour than say 30. Training for staff. So as part of the induction, people would be trained around the risks of industrial vehicles, and also the drivers would be tested for competence periodically to ensure that they maintain a good level of safe responsibility. And also, right at the bottom of the chain, but a very important sort of thing as well, personal protective equipment, high visibility vests for all staff to make sure that they're clearly visible to the vehicles. And now you can go do the quiz for this section.